What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into Dark Knight's Metal #1, this is proving itself to be a really cool story. It's a very elaborate story, but Scott Snyder's stories are always that way. I mean, it took him the better part of like 4 story arcs to build up to the reveal of the Joker. So it's pretty interesting in terms of how he does his stories. But the whole idea is that this opens up with basically this sort of story that's given to us from Carter Hall. Remember, Carter Hall is basically Hawkman, and Hawkman is this guy that has this origin story where he's effectively destined to die and be reborn time and time again. The same thing goes for Kendra Saunders. They're effectively lovers, that they'll always die and they'll always be reborn. They won't know who the other is. And their story is to basically find and encounter one another to essentially be at the other side until they die, and the process repeats itself. But the idea of Dark Knight's Metal is to introduce this concept of nth metal. And what it does, or at least what it did for Carter Hall and for Kendra Saunders, is it basically said that somewhere along the line in the origin of their lives, back before they started this process of death and rebirth, they encountered nth metal from just some, alien civilization somewhere. And the idea was that when they were stabbed by a blade that was made of nth metal, it set them on the process of dying and being reborn, presumably for all eternity. The whole idea of the diary of Carter Hall, so to speak, with regards to Dark Knight's Metal, is that he was on a quest to find out what nth metal was and why it caused him to live this process of death and rebirth over and over and over again. But because of the fact that he dates back to the earliest days of civilization, he's seen a multitude of things take place. And so this story basically opens up with references to 3 different tribes. The first is the tribe of the wolf, the second is the tribe of the bear, and the third is the tribe of the bird. Now, the first 2 are pretty straightforward. The third is a little bit kind of weird, and it really requires a little bit of speculation on our part. The tribe of the wolf is basically the tribe of Vandal Savage. The tribe of the bear is the tribe of the Immortal Man, and the tribe of the bird might be like the Court of Owls, but it's most likely Hawkman himself. Now, with the tribe of the wolf, with regards to Vandal Savage, he is a guy who is basically immortal. Now, the way it originally happened in DC's storytelling is that the Immortal Man and Vandal Savage both basically gained their immortality from a meteorite, more or less. This meteorite crash landed on Earth. Vandal Savage discovered it in the earliest days of, caveman history. It basically imbued him with legitimate immortality, so he could never really die. The Immortal Man made an amulet out of the meteorite, and his exposure to the amulet over time is what gave him his immortality. Now, in the New 52, when DC basically started retelling the stories of Batman, when we got into things like the Court of Owls and the Night of Owls and Batman Endgame and Death of the Family, all those stories written by Scott Snyder, the origin of Vandal Savage was completely reworked. And what Scott Snyder established is that there's actually this substance on Earth called Dionysium. And Dionysium in its most pure form was first encountered by Vandal Savage, and that's how he became immortal. It was later encountered by the Joker, but the Joker encountered an impure form, and the result was that he constantly had to go back and expose himself to Dionysium in order to maintain his longevity. It was really Scott Snyder teasing this idea that so long as Dionysium was present and accessible by the Joker, he would effectively be immortal. Now, in the New 52, we have no references to the Immortal Man. This is the first time we get it. There's been nothing to indicate the Immortal Man exists. This seems to be the first time that we're actually having his character rolled in. And of course, the tribe of the bird, really looking at the idea of Hawkman, this basically indicates that because he was stabbed with nth metal in the early days of his existence, his tribe, he really just kind of had a group of his own and different things like that, and somehow or another he just came to be represented with regards to these different tribes. But again, it's a very short little story here, because what this does is it says that these 3 tribes are now being greeted with a 4th tribe, the tribe of effectively the Dark Knights of Barbados. Now, with regards to the modern day, what this does is it picks up with Mongul. Now, this is kind of cool because this actually comes out of what I believe is a 3-part story, maybe it's a 2-part story, in Superman Batman issues 5 and 6 from the New 52. And this dealt with the idea of a character by the name of Toyman, some kid named Hiro, who was basically like this super smart engineer of sorts based out of Japan. And he had actually designed a video game system that eventually turned into a real life system, in the sense that it was designed to allow people to jump into this sort of virtual reality world and engage in combat, but it eventually manifested to the point that they were controlling actual people, specifically Batman and Superman. So it was an interesting little bit of storytelling at the time. It was really DC just kind of experimenting with what people would be interested in with regards to the launch of the New 52, but it also drew the attention of Mongul. And so this is why Mongul has kidnapped Hero, because the two of them are basically familiar with each other in the sense that Hero is the New 52 iteration of Toyman. Under control of Mongul, he's basically kidnapped the Justice League, thrown them on this new War Moon, which is basically Mongul's war world, and it results in the Justice League being held prisoner using a multitude of different devices and contraptions. For example, crystallized red kryptonite, which keeps Superman's powers from manifesting, boots that basically increase gravity that keep the Flash from just running super fast, different things like that. I mean, it's just really just a way to kind of keep them in place. Now, of course, this goes by pretty fast. There's a new device that's been created by Toyman. The Justice League are forced to fight it. Ultimately, Batman realizes that there's basically these little symbols inside of the machine itself that Hero left there, so Batman and the Justice League would figure out how to actually turn this machine into a giant Voltron, more or less is what everybody's calling it. A giant mecha of sorts, which they can all pilot. It's a Zord. It's the Megazord. They're all just kind of piloting it, and of course they use it to basically overpower Mongul and make their escape, and that's really about it. I mean, there's not much going on here. Why it was added in, I honestly have no earthly clue, but I guess it really is kind of answered in the fact that when they return home, there's this giant mountain that's been erected in the middle of Gotham City, which of course has sent people fleeing for their lives. Now, of course, once the Justice League actually gets up to it, they get inside the mountain, they start investigating around. What we end up getting is this sort of resonance energy that runs directly in line with the energy that Hal Jordan felt from Dark Days, The Forge, and The Casting. And what I mean by that is, if you guys remember in those two stories, which you'll find down in the Dark Nth Metal playlist, there was basically this machine of sorts that Batman had constructed, which ultimately had just been torn to pieces by the Joker. And the idea was that Batman, alongside the Signal, Duke Thomas, the newest addition to the Bat family, had used his powers to essentially sort of rebuild this thing, in addition to Green Lantern using his ring to recreate the machine, so to speak, and it resulted in them working on it. But the harmonic frequency that this machine put off as it was designed by Batman is exactly what they're feeling here, but it's basically encasing some sort of pod of sorts. And so in the middle of all this, before they can actually crack it open, they're basically met with the arrival of Kendra Saunders. Now again, this is a bit of an interesting scenario because it basically treats Kendra Saunders as if nobody knows who she is and she's never existed in the New 52, which is kind of interesting here because it's like this wholly new introduction of a concept within DC. I mean, it's not, but DC kind of treats it that way with regards to this story. But what it does is it begins hitting at the nature of what's going on with Carter Hall. And again, that's why all this basically comes together in the sense that Nth Metal came from a place that nobody really understands and nobody knows anything about it. Now, we know just by virtue of the tie-ins that Nth Metal comes from the Dark Multiverse, but no one seems to know that. Instead, what Kendra Saunders does is basically tell the various superheroes here that when Carter Hall was going around and investigating the various issues that were going on with Nth Metal, the idea of Nth Metal itself, where initially the investigation in its earliest days was just him, as time progressed and people like Vandal Savage began to rise in prominence, people like the Immortal Man began to rise in prominence, you know, heroes like Red Tornado, who was really a really cool character from before New 52, as these various heroes began to rise in prominence, Carter Hall basically began recruiting them to his cause. And it was essentially anybody who could help in any form or fashion, whether they were scientists, engineers, whatever the case may be. As long as they were intelligent, they were basically put to task trying to figure out what Nth Metal is. Now, what Kendra also does is say that just by virtue of his own investigations, Carter Hall became aware of the multiverse. Now, we don't know how. She essentially says this is the multiverse as it exists, and it's essentially the multiversal map from Final Crisis going into the New 52. The Final Crisis aspect, I'd like you to also keep in the back of your head for a second, but the whole idea is that when the question was asked where Nth Metal came from, the vibrational frequency that it emits does not come from any one particular universe. Now, we've talked about this with regards to our tie-ins for Dark Nth Metal, so if you've heard those, bear with me for a second. But in DC Comics, when it comes to different universes, every universe has a unique energy signature. So think of the energy signature like colors. Every universe is its own distinct color. If you can become that color, you can enter that universe by saying that simply if you can vibrate at the correct frequency, you can enter that alternate universe. That's how the Flash was able to jump from reality to reality in the early days of DC's creation of the multiverse back in 1961. It was the idea that the Flash inadvertently vibrated at the right frequency to enter an alternate reality. Now, once it was that he realized what he had done, then it basically became this scenario where DC simply said the Flash can go into any universe he wants to as long as he vibrates at the right frequency. He has to know what the frequency is, but once he learns, he can vibrate that way and travel from one universe to another. The issue here is that with each one of these universes having its own unique frequency, the frequency the Nth Metal puts off is not attuned to any one of those universes. And so the question that Kendra Saunders asks, and the question that Carter Hall had asked, is if it doesn't come from this multiverse, then where does it come from? And this is one of the interesting scenarios that DC's toying around with, that there is the multiverse as it exists in the main DC line of stories, then there's the Dark Multiverse. And so the overall idea here is that they are effectively saying that this dark multiverse is composed of dark matter and dark energy. And it's actually kind of interesting because the whole principle behind this is basically saying that in the main DC universe, everything is made up of like atoms. 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom give you H2O, they give you water. But in terms of the atomic level, it's largely empty space. That empty space is composed of dark matter and dark energy. And so what they're effectively saying is that this dark multiverse as it exists is far larger than the main DC multiverse itself, but they don't know how big. The other thing to keep in mind here is that this is all speculation. There's no absolute answers here. It's literally Kendra Saunders and everybody trying to figure out what's going on, trying to understand what's happening. At the same time, as they began going through and as she began researching what she could find from Carter Hall anyway, before he had disappeared into presumably the Dark Multiverse, is that along the line, the character of Barbados, this godly being from the Dark Multiverse, had looked to cross over into the main DC universe by way of Batman. And that's the whole basis behind this. Now, of course, in the middle of this whole investigation, things really just kind of pick up when Red Tornado suddenly wakes up. Now, it's a little bit of a sidetrack here because we'll jump back into that Batman thing here in a second. But the whole idea behind this is that Red Tornado is effectively this android that can manipulate winds of sorts, different things like that. DC tried to experiment and turn him into an elemental of sorts, but he was basically a member of the Justice League for quite some time, Justice League International, played some pretty cool roles here and there, but he's one of those characters that a lot of older fans were excited to see. He's really niche, but it's basically DC rolling his character back into the modern day continuity. Now, how he got here, we don't know. We simply know that Kendra Saunders and the Blackhawks have been holding him captive this entire time. But one of the things that I want you guys to notice is that with him basically dominating like Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Superman, he's certainly a force to be reckoned with in terms of what he's capable of. But what he keeps shouting is that they opened the door and that he warned them not to open the door. Now, this is a direct reference to the events of Dark Knight's The Forge and the Casting when Batman activated the device that opened the door to the Dark Multiverse, not realizing that he did it. And that brings us back to the continuation of this circumstance, because one of the people that Carter Hall had sent in to investigate the Dark Multiverse was Red Tornado. Red Tornado, of course, basically returned. But the idea is that Red Tornado is aware of the fact that if the door is open to the Dark Multiverse, all it's going to do is let in absolute evil. So again, not a lot of straight answers coming from Scott Snyder, and that's standard when it comes to his storytelling. He gives us a lot of mysterious, a lot of clues, a lot of these, well, what do you think will happen next for the first, 2 or 3 issues? And then he actually gets into the meat and potatoes of it later on. Now, of course, in all the panic, Batman basically bails out and makes his escape because the only reason he was even there in the first place was to see how much Kendra Saunders and the Blackhawks knew. Now, a lot of that goes into the All-Star Batman Rebirth line of stories in the sense that Batman was aware of Kendra Saunders, he was aware of the Blackhawks. The whole point was to get there, see what they know about this mysterious nth metal, this material that he's been researching all this time. And once he found out they had a sample of it, his goal was to get in there, take it, and leave. And this gets us into the whole idea of Batman and the events of Final Crisis. And that's one of the reasons why we covered the Final Crisis story in the first place, is because what Kendra Saunders basically says is that going through the various wordings of, Carter Hall himself, ultimately the person that is responsible for allowing the Dark Multiverse into the main DC universe is Batman himself, going by the, traditional idea of the word Wayne as it's been translated over the years. Now, what the Journal of Carter Hall basically says here is that initially Barbados didn't know anything about the positive multiverse. It wasn't until the events of Final Crisis when Batman was hit with the Omega Sanction by Darkseid and sent all the way back into the distant past of humanity's history that Barbados became aware of the positive multiverse. When Batman was hit with the Omega Sanction and sent into the past, it sent shockwaves throughout both the Dark Multiverse and the positive multiverse. And with that shockwave crossing the Dark Multiverse, Barbados basically woke up. He had this, light bulb in his head and realized the positive multiverse exists. And so the goal was to pass through Earth Zero, the main DC universe, and then go directly into the positive multiverse. And so that's how it is that Final Crisis ties into this story. And that's the significance of Batman. When Scott Snyder in these guys say Batman is the means by which the Dark Multiverse will be let in, it's because one, he was sent into the past in Final Crisis, shockwaves were sent throughout both sides of the positive and negative multiverse, and he basically created the device, and he had the device designed that would open a portal to the Dark Multiverse, not really knowing what it was that he was doing. And so in the middle of all this, when he basically begins to realize that all of this is true, he's basically met with a being called Dream, who's part of a group called the Endless. Now, the Endless are a really, really, really cool concept in the realm of DC Comics, and we've never talked about them. We've never even referenced the Endless once, so I'm going to give you guys a crash course in what the Endless are. The Endless originally appeared in the second volume of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and the Sandman series largely dealt with the idea of just a guy who would get these sort of prophetic dreams. But the Endless are somewhat like DC's answer to Marvel's cosmic entities, but not exactly. The idea is that in the Marvel universe, the cosmic entities are sort of this representation of concepts within the realm of Marvel. Eternity represents time and infinity represents space, or something along those lines. The Endless in DC's comics are not a representation of different things, they simply are those things. So when it comes to like the dream of the Endless, it is basically the concept of people dreaming. You know, when you lay down, you go to sleep, and you dream about whatever, you know, that one girl that you really want to get with, or the one guy you really want to get with, or getting a Robcore ring. Whatever it is that you dream about, Endless is that, the amalgamation of your dreams, more or less. But the reason why this matters is because when it comes to the Endless, there's something like 7 of them, I think. I think it's Destiny, Destruction, Death, Dream. I want to say Delirium, Despair, and Desire, I think is what they're called. I'm not super familiar on the Endless, so I apologize if I got those wrong. But for the most part, we don't really see them all that often in DC, or at least not in the main DC line of stories. But the whole idea is that the arrival of Dream specifically is done for a purpose. It really seems to be, in the eyes of Scott Snyder, an explanation of what the Dark Multiverse is. The indication here is that the Dark Multiverse is not necessarily a place where everything that can go wrong has gone wrong. It's a place that was created by virtue of a nightmarish situation. It's basically a multiverse that exists of all the worst things that can happen because people dreamed them up. It's like where people's nightmares go, coalesce, and then presumably took form. The problem with this, and the reason why we really have to wait for definitive answer from Scott Snyder, is because in this story, it's basically established that the Dark Multiverse predates the main DC multiverse by quite a while. So if it predates the existing multiverse, people couldn't have dreamt it up because they weren't alive to dream it. Again, that's why it gets into kind of a weird boat in a weird situation, because we're just sort of left to try to figure out what's going on. But the very presence of one of the Endless here is a huge deal, because it's the equivalent of, in Marvel Comics, if some event takes place and Eternity shows up and says, hey man, we got to talk about what's happening. That's when you know things are really getting to pop off. Things are really beginning to get serious, because we have basically these immortal, immutable constructs showing up and telling Batman things are about to get pretty dire. With that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.